let's talk about two very different ways of understanding what it means to be human. Two different answers to the questions. Who am I? Is my identity something given to me or something I must create? That's the difference between essentialism and existentialism, of which the latter emerges from continental ethics. Let's dive into the fascinating world of continental ethics, a set of philosophical ideas that emerged during the 19th and 20th centuries from the continent of Europe, hence the name. These ideas have had a profound influence on 20th century theological thought. One of the hallmarks of continental ethics is its emphasis on meaning, context, authenticity, and personal choice. It asks deeply introspective questions about the meaning of life and the individual's role within it. These philosophies invite us to explore how we derive meaning and make choices that feel authentic to our personal experiences. As we introduce these concepts, consider how they resonate with your own experiences and beliefs. The notion of personal choice and authenticity in shaping our lives is a powerful one and central to understanding continental ethics. Certainly this ethic is one that challenges traditional views and inspires seek authenticity in life. This video is based on a short story written by Kierkegaard called The King and the Maiden, which really aims to highlight an important thrust of continental ethics on the whole, the idea of authentic action.
Suppose there was a king who loved a humble maiden. The king was like no other king. Every statesman trembled before his power. No one dared breathe a word against him, for he had the strength to crush all opponents. And yet this mighty king was melted by love for a humble maiden. How could he declare his love for her? In an odd sort of way, his very kingliness tied his hands. If he brought her to the palace and crowned her head with jewels and clothed her body in royal robes, she would surely not resist. No one dared resist him. But would she love him? She would say she loved him, of course, but would she truly? Or would she live with him in fear, nursing a private grief for the life she had left behind? Would she be happy at his side? How could he know? If he rode to her forest cottage in his royal carriage, with an armed escort waving bright banners, that too would overwhelm her. He did not want a cringing subject. He wanted a lover, an equal. He wanted her to forget that he was a king and she was a humble maiden, and to let shared love cross over the gulf between them. For it is only in love that the unequal can be made equal. The king, convinced he could not elevate the maiden without crushing her freedom, resolved to descend. He clothed himself as a common man and approached her cottage with a worn cloak fluttering loosely about him. It was not just a disguise. The king took on a whole new identity. He renounced the throne to declare his love and to win mine.
Kierkegaard's parable of the King and the Maiden. This story is told in Kierkegaard's philosophical fragments. It gives important insights into his understanding of the relationship between faith and reason, of religiousness, and God's interaction with humans, particularly in the life of Jesus. The great king falls in love with a poor maiden in his kingdom. He wants to win her heart, so that she comes to love him freely, and he wants to exalt her to his own status, to love her as an equal rather than someone of lower status. He desires a relationship of unity based on equality and freedom. But he realizes that if he meets her as the king, he will fail to win her heart in this way. This is because she may come to love him simply out of fear or a sense of obedience, meaning that her freedom to love is impaired. She will also always see herself as inferior, so he will fail to win her over as an equal. Since she is of lower status, she may even lack the ability to understand him, his motives, and the dilemma he faces in starting a relationship with her. The relationship between the two cannot be grounded in her ascent to his level. Rather, the king has to descend to her level. To achieve this, he disguises himself as a servant and appears to her to win her heart. In this way, if he wins her heart, he knows that it is freely given by her, and that their relationship is a true love between equals. In this parable, the king represents God, and the maiden symbolizes all human persons. The text notes that this is an imperfect analogy, though, because it deals only with human relationships, not a transcendent religious relationship. What does this parable tell us about God and about the human relationship to God? First, it asserts God's epistemic distance from human persons. This refers to the hiddenness and mystery of God. It also identifies our inability to know God, or even whether he exists. His existence is a source of contention, doubt, or even offense to our reason. Like the king, God must remain hidden to us in order to preserve our freedom. Even the despair, alienation, and isolation we may feel from God are partly explicable as a result of his desire to allow us to make the choice about whether to have faith. The parable hopes to establish that faith in God is not slavish obedience, nor does it require certainty about God's existence or knowledge. Rather, it is choosing to commit in hope and love in a way that preserves human freedom and creativity. Though philosophers like Sartre and Nietzsche criticize theism for enslaving the will, providing a set of norms and fixed essence of human nature that must be obeyed, the parable contends that God values human freedom over everything else, and that religiousness is a free and creative response to divine love. The objective of divine activity and the aim of faith is apotheosis. This means achieving a relationship of unity, equality, and oneness with God, just as the king and the maiden obtain a relationship of unity in their loving marriage. The parable also offers a Christian interpretation of the life of Jesus. Just as the king must put on a disguise in order to have a loving relationship, God must put off his nature and become a human person in order to allow for loving relationships with human beings.
Essentialism says every being has an essence, a nature, a purpose, a built-in meaning. Identity is prior to existence. You are born with a purpose, with a nature, with a telos. Aristotle said, everything has an eidos, or a form, and telos, an end or a goal. Thomas Aquinas noted that humans have a God-given essence, that rationality is ordered toward God. And the Christian tradition broadly puts it, purpose is rooted in the imago Dei. The bottom line, essence precedes existence. And this is the philosophical standpoint from which we have our foundation in almost every other philosophy we have studied this semester. The entire traditional Western ethic is built upon this premise that we are created beings with a given purpose. And our task is to fulfill that divinely given task, to be who we were created to be. Existentialism says humans first exist and only later define themselves. There is no predetermined human nature. Meaning isn't received. It is created through choices. Humans are radically free and radically responsible. Existence precedes essence. This is the heartbeat of existentialism. So let's embark on a journey into one of the most challenging, personal, and transformative areas of modern philosophy, existentialist ethics. This isn't a philosophy that offers easy answers or comforting doctrines. Instead, it asks us to confront the most fundamental questions of human existence head-on, without the comfort of absolute answers. Prepare yourselves to think deeply, not just about abstract principles. but about the very structure of your own life. The foundations of existentialism, freedom, and the crisis of meaning. To understand existentialism, we must first grasp the historical and intellectual crisis from which it emerged. This was a period where the traditional pillars holding up Western civilization's sense of meaning, religion, tradition, even science, seemed to crumble, forcing humanity to confront a terrifying void. To get a feel for this, I want you to picture yourself standing in an empty theater at 3 o'clock in the morning. The stage lights are off, the audience has gone home, and you are completely alone with the realization that there is no script for your life. No director will tell you what to say, no playwright has written your lines, and no audience expects a particular performance. You must create every scene, every dialogue, every meaningful moment from nothing but your own choices. This, in essence, is the human condition according to the existentialists. We are actors thrust onto a stage with no script, no director, and no predetermined role. This existentialist moment didn't arise in a vacuum. It was the culmination of powerful historical and social forces. The Protestant Reformation, with its rejection of hierarchical church authority, had already placed a new emphasis on subjective inwardness, creating an individual who stood alone before God and truth. This fostered a new spirit of self-reliance, but also a loss of the communal bonds that had defined traditional society. Then came the Industrial Revolution, which introduced newly mechanized working conditions and vast impersonal forms of bureaucratic administration, further alienating the individual. Against this backdrop, the rise of nihilism in the 19th century, famously captured in Friedrich Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God, signaled the collapse of a transcendent moral framework that had guided the West for centuries. This intellectual crisis was then seared into the collective consciousness by the unprecedented trauma of 2 world wars, the horror of the Nazi death camps, and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In this new world, traditional certainties seem not only hollow, but dangerously naive. An entire generation was forced to confront the raw, anxiety-provoking givens of death, freedom, and the haunting possibility of meaninglessness. It was from this wreckage that a new kind of philosophy was born, one that started not from abstract speculation, but from the lived experience of being human in a silent universe. This intellectual movement was championed by a diverse group of thinkers, artists, and writers. While we will focus on a few key figures, it's important to recognize the breadth of this conversation. Some of the pioneers of the existentialist movement were Søren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche, several 20th century German philosophers, to include Martin Heidegger and Karl Jaspers. Many French existentialists such as Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus, and Gabriel Marcel, in addition to well-known contemporary authors and artists. These thinkers, despite their many disagreements, all grappled with the same fundamental problem. If the old sources of meaning are gone, where do we turn? Their answer was revolutionary. We must turn inward to the fact of our own existence. Friedrich Nietzsche was a 19th century philosopher who famously declared, "God is dead," though not in the literal way you might imagine. Within his context, what he meant was that God had lost authority in the modern world. You might compare him with the clockmaker who creates his beautiful watches, lovingly places each one in the display case, and then walks away, never again to be involved with them. Nietzsche believed traditional morality was collapsing and observed this as a cultural phenomenon in which we no longer believe in the moral foundation we have inherited from our ancestors, what was previously passed down from one generation to the next. And this creates a crisis. If God is gone, then meaning must come from us. Furthermore, the fundamental human drive is not survival, but self-overcoming. The mandates are to become who you are through authenticity, create your own values, and rise above the herd mentality. Nietzsche also posits what he terms the Übermensch, or the Superman. This is the ideal human, one who authors his own values and lives his life creatively, courageously, and beyond moral authority. Nietzsche's genealogy. When Nietzsche uses the term genealogy, he is not talking about 23andMe or Ancestry.com. This is an historical, linguistic, and psychological excavation of how our moral concepts came to be, like an archaeological dig for ancient ethics. He wanted to uncover the origins, shifts, and power dynamics hidden within the language, as he called it, of morality itself. Moral words such as good, evil, sin, guilt, or virtue did not just drop into our taxonomy fully formed. For Nietzsche, they evolved, and often through social conflict, resentment, and power struggles. So Nietzsche's genealogy traces these concepts backwards, exposes relationships shaping them, and portrays how language hides these relationships. Through layers of moralizing, Nietzsche argues that if you want to understand a moral value today, you should trace the etymology of the word behind it. For instance, he uses the word Schuld, German for both guilt and debt. He uses this to argue that the moral concept of guilt originated in economic exchange, not divine law, and that, therefore, punishment began as a repayment of debt to a creditor, and evolved into a moral category in which one owes God or society obedience. He uses this to show that 1. Morality is constructed, not eternal. 2. Our values were designed by particular groups for particular purposes. 3. Language conceals history. 4. What we consider moral truth is actually a set of inherited interpretations. For Nietzsche and other non-religious existentialists, if the essence of morality is historical and contingent, then humans must define their own essence or identity. Self-authorship becomes the only pathway to authenticity. Now, Nietzsche was not technically an existentialist, but deeply influential to the movement. He rejects essentialism entirely, and for him, human identity is self-creation through power, courage, authenticity, and so we delve into Nietzsche's exploration of moral language through his concept of genealogy. In looking at his concept of ressentiment, a French term Nietzsche used to describe a form of moral resentment. This concept reflects the conflict between the strong and the weak, where the weak develop a moral system that inversely values the traits of the strong. This concept is pivotal in understanding how Nietzsche viewed the evolution of morality. Next, Nietzsche provocatively suggests that truth has no inherent meaning. He argues that truth is merely a construct, an amalgamation of embellished word pictures used to manipulate and control society. Language, in his view, is a tool wielded by those in power. This is the weak for Nietzsche to create illusions that maintain social order. Nietzsche's genealogy is like doing moral forensics. He digs into the etymology of words to show that our moral ideas didn't fall from the sky. They evolved. When he tracks words like good and evil, he finds they originally meant something totally different. This proves that morality is not essential or eternal. it's historical and constructed. That's why he says we must create our own values. The cornerstone: existence precedes essence. The single most revolutionary contribution of existentialism is its radical reversal of thousands of years of Western philosophical and theological thought about human nature. This idea, existence precedes essence, is what Jean-Paul Sartre called the first principle of existentialism, and it forms the bedrock for everything else we will discuss. For millennia, the prevailing view was that essence precedes existence. To understand this, consider an object like a hammer. The idea of the hammer, its essence, its purpose as a tool for driving nails, existed in the mind of its creator before any particular hammer came into physical existence. Its pre-given nature, or essence, defined what it was. Traditional philosophy applied this same logic to us. Whether through a divine plan, natural law, or biological programming, it was believed that we humans possess a predetermined essence, a human nature that defines our purpose before we are even born. Existentialism shatters this assumption. For human beings, and for human beings alone, existence precedes essence. This means, as Sartre so powerfully puts it, that man exists, turns up, appears on the scene, and only afterwards defines himself. We exist first. We simply appear in the world, and only then, through our choices and actions, do we create who we are. There is no instruction manual, no blueprint, no predefined purpose for a human being. We simply are, and from that raw fact of existence, we must build our own essence. The implications of this are staggering. If this principle is true, then there is no fixed human nature to be discovered. When a teenager is struggling with questions about their career, their values, or their identity, they are not trying to uncover their pre-existing true self. They are quite literally creating that identity through each decision they make. Think about this in concrete terms. When that teenager chooses to volunteer at an animal shelter, they are not merely expressing some innate compassion that was always there. According to the existentialists, they are creating compassion within themselves through the act of choosing compassionate behavior. The self emerges from action, not the other way around. This act of self-creation is only possible because we possess a radical and inescapable freedom. Condemned to be free, the terrifying weight of radical freedom. When we speak of freedom in an existential context, we are not talking about the casual, everyday concept of liberty, like the freedom to choose between brands of cereal or to vote for a political candidate. Existential freedom is an absolute, profound, and inescapable condition of being human. In fact, Sartre famously declared that we are condemned to be free. What a strange and paradoxical phrase. How can freedom be a condemnation? It's a condemnation because we never asked for it. We were thrown into existence without our consent. And yet, from the moment we become conscious, we cannot escape the necessity of making choices. Even refusing to choose is itself a choice. We are responsible for everything we do, with, as Sartre says, no excuses behind us, nor justifications before us. Because there is no God, no universal moral law, and no fixed human nature to guide us. The full weight of responsibility for our lives and for the values we create rests squarely on our own shoulders. This confrontation with the full scope of our freedom produces what the existentialists call anguish. This isn't ordinary fear, which is typically directed at a specific object. Anguish is the emotional response to the terrifying weight of our own possibility. Sartre provides a powerful illustration. Picture a man standing on the edge of a cliff. He feels vertigo, a fear of falling. But the existential anguish he feels comes not just from the fear of accidentally slipping, but from the terrifying recognition that nothing prevents him from choosing to jump. His freedom is so absolute that even his own self-preservation is a choice, not a given. Every choice we make carries enormous moral weight, because in choosing for ourselves, we are contributing to the definition of what it means to be human. So, to recap these foundational pillars, in a world stripped of its traditional sources of meaning, the crisis of meaning, we find ourselves defined not by a pre-existing nature, but by the raw fact of our existence. Existence precedes essence. This condition thrusts upon us a terrifying and absolute freedom and responsibility for creating who we are, condemned to be free. Next time, we will explore the emotional consequences of this condition, anxiety, and absurdity, and the common temptation to flee from this very freedom. Jean-Paul Sartre. His key premise, existence precedes essence, is such because for him there is now and was no God to design human nature. He said, man first exists, then defines himself afterward. There is no blueprint, no cosmic purpose. The revelation of freedom, existential anxiety, angst, and now building upon the sobering idea that we are condemned to be free, we explore the psychological and emotional landscape of that freedom and what it entails. While modern society often treats anxiety as a pathology to be eliminated, existentialists see it as a fundamental and revealing aspect of the human condition. It is not a sign of weakness, but a signal that we are honestly confronting the truth of our situation. The existentialists use the term angst or existential anxiety to describe this feeling. Unlike ordinary fear, which has a specific object, we fear losing a job, we fear a spider, we fear public speaking, angst has no object. It is the psyche's response to the sheer scope of our freedom. Søren Kierkegaard described it as the dizziness of freedom, the overwhelming awareness of the infinite possibilities our freedom presents, with absolutely no guaranteed outcomes. It is the feeling that arises when the familiar structures and certainties of our lives dissolve, leaving us face to face with the raw fact of our need to choose. You have all felt this, even if you didn't have a name for it. Consider the college graduate suddenly stripped of the clear milestones of academic life, facing an uncertain future and the crushing question, who will I become now? Think of the new parent holding their child and feeling the awesome, overwhelming responsibility of knowing their choices will fundamentally shape another human being. Or picture yourself in a relationship when you have that unsettling realization that your partner is a completely free being who, at any moment, could choose to stop loving you. In each case, the anxiety is not about a specific threat, but about the groundlessness of our choices and the weight of our freedom. This anxiety is only intensified by the stage on which this drama of freedom unfolds, a universe that offers no answers to our deepest questions. The silence of the universe, the absurd and nausea. This brings us to another core existential experience, the absurd. The absurd, as Albert Camus defined it, is not a quality of the world itself, nor is it a quality of the human mind. Rather, it is the product of a clash, a divorce between two things: our innate human desire for meaning, reason, and purpose, and the unreasonable silence of the world. Our minds are meaning-making machines, constantly asking why. Yet we find ourselves in a universe that offers no reply, a cosmos that is completely indifferent to our longings for justification. Camus' ultimate metaphor for this condition is the myth of Sisyphus. You'll recall that Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to an eternity of futile labor. He must push a massive boulder up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down each time he nears the summit. For Camus, Sisyphus is the absurd hero. His struggle is cosmically meaningless, and he knows it. He is fully conscious of the futility of his task. This, for Camus, mirrors the human condition. We must find our meaning in a struggle that we know has no ultimate cosmic justification. Sartre described a similar, though perhaps more visceral experience he called nausea. This isn't physical sickness, but a profound disorientation that arises from the recognition of existence's fundamental contingency and groundlessness. In his novel Nausea, the protagonist Antoine Roquentin looks at the root of a chestnut tree and is suddenly overwhelmed by its brute, reasonless existence. The root is not beautiful or useful. It has no purpose. It simply is, and this raw, unjustified isness strikes him with a sickening vertigo. This is the recognition that nothing, not the tree, not the laws of physics, not our own lives, has any inherent necessity. Everything simply exists without reason. Given this terrifying freedom, this profound anxiety, and this collision with an absurd universe, how do most of us cope? The most common response, the existentialists argue, is a flight from freedom itself. The escape from freedom, bad faith, and the they-self. The weight of radical freedom is so intense, the anxiety so profound, that human beings have developed sophisticated strategies of self-deception to avoid it. These strategies are a core obstacle to living an authentic life because they allow us to pretend we are not free, to pretend we have no choice in who we are. Denying transcendence, our freedom. This is when we treat ourselves as a mere object, a thing with fixed characteristics defined by our situation, or what the existentialists call our facticity. A classic example is the person who consistently arrives late and explains it by saying, "I'm just not a punctual person." This statement treats punctuality as a fixed, unchangeable trait, like the color of one's eyes. It's a lie. In reality, that person is choosing other priorities over punctuality in each moment. They are denying their freedom to choose differently. Denying facticity, our situation. This is the opposite lie, where we pretend we are pure freedom, completely unbound by our circumstances, our bodies, or our past actions. Sartre's most famous illustration of bad faith is that of the waiter in a cafe. He performs his role with an exaggerated theatrical precision. His movements are a little too sharp, his voice a little too solicitous. He is playing at being a waiter. Why? Because by becoming the role, by reducing himself to the social function of waiter, he escapes the terrifying burden of having to choose who to be. He is hiding his freedom behind a social mask. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger described a similar, though more pervasive phenomenon he called the they-self, das Man. This is our tendency to lose our individual selves in the anonymous public. We do what one does, think what people think, and find shocking what they find shocking. The they, as Heidegger describes it, is a powerful, tranquilizing force that prescribes the kind of being of everydayness. It levels all authentic possibilities down to a comfortable, inauthentic averageness. This tranquilizer alienates us from our own unique existence by prescribing the kind of life we should lead, relieving us of the anxiety of having to invent it for ourselves. To summarize, the confrontation with our freedom reveals the profound anxiety of our groundless choices and the absurdity of our search for meaning in a silent universe. This experience is so unsettling that many flee into the comforting self-deceptions of bad faith and the conformity of the they self. This sets the stage perfectly for our final session, where we will ask, what is the ethical alternative? How can we overcome this flight and live an authentic life? The ethical response, authenticity. At this point, we have journeyed through the crisis of meaning, the burden of freedom, and the temptation of self-deception. Now we turn to the existentialist ethical response. That response can be summed up in a single word: authenticity. But I must warn you, this is not the simple pop culture slogan, "Be yourself." The existentialist call to authenticity is a far more demanding task. It is the challenge of courageously accepting your radical freedom and taking full responsibility for creating yourself in a groundless world. To be authentic is to own your choices completely, without seeking justification from any external authority. It involves a kind of radical honesty about your freedom, your situation, and your choices. Different thinkers have offered different models for what this courageous life looks like. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard posited a concept termed the night of faith. This describes an individual who makes a passionate, personality-defining commitment to a subjective truth. This may require a leap beyond universal ethics, as exemplified by Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche posited the concept of the Übermensch. Essentially, this is an individual who overcomes the slave morality of the herd, embraces life in its totality, amor fati, and has the strength to create their own values and give style to their life. And the philosopher Martin Heidegger developed a concept he called Entschlossenheit, or resoluteness. This would be an individual who, shaken by anxiety, pulls themselves out of the they self to seize upon their own possibilities, making their historical world mine with a clear-eyed and focused commitment. A crucial catalyst for achieving an authentic life, according to Heidegger, is our honest confrontation with mortality. His concept of being toward death argues that it is only when we truly accept our own finitude that life gains its urgency. The awareness that our time is limited is precisely what frees us from the trivial concerns and distractions of the they, clarifying which projects are truly worth pursuing. It forces us to ask, with the limited time I have, what kind of person do I choose to become? But this authentic life is not lived in a vacuum. We live with and among other people, which raises the crucial ethical question of how to relate to other free individuals. The ethical challenge, hell is other people. Here we arrive at the central problem of intersubjectivity in existentialism. If every individual is a radical center of freedom, creating their own world of meaning, what happens when these worlds collide? Our relationships become fraught with conflict as we constantly risk being turned into an object by the freedom of others. Sartre took a famously pessimistic view of this dynamic. He described a phenomenon called the look, le regard, which is the experience of being seen by another person. The moment another person's gaze falls upon you, you are no longer just a free subject for yourself. You become an object in their world, subject to their judgments and interpretations. This experience can strip you of your subjectivity. It is this inescapable conflict between competing freedoms that Sartre was describing with his famous line from the play No Exit. Hell is other people. He didn't mean that other people are simply annoying. He meant that the struggle to preserve our own subjectivity against the objectifying gaze of others is a fundamental and hellish aspect of the human condition. His partner, Simone de Beauvoir, offered a more optimistic and ethically robust alternative. She argued that while conflict is a risk, it is not the only possibility. She envisioned a form of authentic love as a relationship founded on the mutual recognition and nurturing of two freedoms. Rather than trying to possess or control the other, authentic love involves two people willing each other's freedom. This forms the core of her ethics of ambiguity. De Beauvoir agreed with Sartre that in a world without absolute moral laws, we are the ones who create values. A moral life, therefore, is one where we first will our own freedom. But because our freedom is inextricably bound up with the freedom of others, an ethical obligation follows. As Sartre explains this principle, I am obliged to want others to have freedom at the same time that I want my own freedom. My freedom depends on a world where freedom itself is possible, and that means I have a responsibility to challenge oppression and create conditions where others can realize their own freedom. This is the heart of existentialist ethics. The ultimate moral good is freedom itself. Now, how do we build a life that honors this principle? The architecture of a meaningful life. Having confronted meaninglessness, embraced freedom, and accepted our ethical responsibility to others, the ultimate existential task is to actively construct a meaningful life. Remember, meaning is not something you find, it is something you make. Sartre argued that we do this through the sustained pursuit of fundamental projects. These are not just goals, like getting a promotion or running a marathon. A project is an overarching way of being that organizes our choices and gives our life coherence. One might undertake the project of being a healer, an artist, a seeker of justice, or a builder of community. This fundamental project becomes the architecture of the self, the framework within which our daily choices create our essence over time. This brings us finally back to Sisyphus. How can his life of futile labor be meaningful? Camus argues that in the face of the absurd, we have three choices. We can commit literal suicide, which he rejects as a surrender. We can commit philosophical suicide by taking a leap of faith into a comforting belief system that denies the absurd, which he rejects as intellectually dishonest. Or we can choose the third way, revolt. Revolt is the decision to continue living and creating meaning despite our full recognition of absurdity. Sisyphus's rebellion lies in his conscious defiance of his absurd fate. He's fully aware of his condition, yet he continues to push the boulder with passion and integrity. The meaning is not in reaching the summit. That is impossible. The meaning is found in the dignity of the struggle itself. As Camus famously and hauntingly concludes, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Christian existentialism. As this is a Christian ethics course, let us delve into that side of existentialism. Christian existentialists agree with the existentialist focus on freedom, choice, and authenticity, but reject the idea that the universe is meaningless. Rather, they say, humans must choose, but God provides the grounding for meaning. And so, Christian existentialism blends existential freedom with divine purpose and personal encounter with God. Søren Kierkegaard, the father of Christian existentialism, and a Danish philosopher and devout Christian, encountered his philosophical view in response to the overly rational, formulaic Christianity of his time. His central insight is that the authentic Christian life requires personal, passionate commitment. For Kierkegaard, truth isn't merely intellectual, it must be personally appropriated. Faith is an actual, personal, and lived relationship. However, faith, in and of itself, isn't a logical certainty. It is a choice, a leap into a depth of trust in the person of God. Kierkegaard additionally offers a framework of what he terms the stages of life. The first is aesthetic, pleasure-driven. This stage is made up of infants, toddlers, young children, teenagers. It is self-centered and guided by desire. The second stage he terms ethical, duty-driven. This stage is the young adult, embarking upon his career, recognizing the need to provide for himself and for his family. He acts out of duty. And the third stage is religious, a surrender and commitment to God. This describes the established adult, settled, experienced, and ready to submit to his Creator. And if you'll notice, the stages of life model is a framework that cycles through utilitarianism in the aesthetic stage, Kantian ethics in the ethical stage, and natural law or divine command theory for the final religious stage. Existential movement for Kierkegaard moves from self-centeredness toward God-centered authenticity. Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was a German pastor and theologian who resisted Hitler and later died in a concentration camp because of it. He is the epitome of the modern Christian existentialist. Bonhoeffer offered several concepts toward a Christian existentialist ethic, which bear repeating: responsible freedom. He believed that true freedom is expressed in responsibility toward others. We can see this in his own life, as he stood up for right in the face of evil for the sake of the oppressed. Costly grace. For Bonhoeffer, grace required a lived, authentic commitment. And cheap grace, faith without discipleship, was to be rejected as inauthentic. This is most easily seen in the Epistle of James. In the Bible, faith without works is dead. Ethics of reality. Bonhoeffer posited that ethics must engage with concrete situations, not abstract rules. In order to be considered a moral concept, it must come from a place of truth and experience. One cannot be guided by law, which has no basis in reality. Christ as the man for others. Bonhoeffer describes the ideal of existential freedom as fulfilled in self-giving, sacrificial love. Jesus on the cross for our salvation, and later, his own life given in fighting for the oppressed. Bonhoeffer's existentialism is deeply ethical and profoundly relational. The final Christian existentialist we will discuss is none other than Martin Buber, whose key idea within this framework is called I-thou versus I-it. In other words, human identity is shaped by relationships. The idea of the I-it relationship involves treating people as objects or using them for some purpose. Immanuel Kant would have termed this as using others as a means to an end. Alternatively, the I-thou relationship affects deep presence, authentic encounter, and mutual recognition. The sacred, says Buber, appears in genuine relationship. All real living is meeting. Martin Buber. For Buber, God is the eternal thou, such that every I-thou encounter becomes a window into authentic relationship with God. Existentialism here becomes relational and reverent, and so our journey through existentialist ethics, both atheist and Christian, comes to a close. We have traced an arc from the collapse of old certainties and the chilling recognition of a silent universe to the terrifying realization of our absolute freedom and responsibility through the ever-present temptation to flee that freedom into self-deception and conformity, and finally, to the courageous and ethical decision to create an authentic life. It is a life built through self-defining projects, through relationships that will the freedom of others, and through a constant, conscious revolt against the absurd. This is both the burden and the glory of being human, to be the sole author of your own existence in a world that offers no script. On the secular side, exemplified by thinkers like Nietzsche and Sartre, the absence of God means that meaning must be created by the individual. Here, freedom is absolute, and morality is seen as a human creation. Authenticity is about self-definition, and anxiety often arises from a sense of meaninglessness. In contrast, Christian existentialists like Kierkegaard, Bonhoeffer, and Buber argue that God provides meaning, and our task is to choose to live it. Freedom, in this view, is relational and responsible. Morality is a response to God's call, and authenticity involves a faithful, relational response to God. The anxiety here stems from the challenge of obedience and trust. These perspectives highlight the differences between anti-religious and Christian existentialism, offering us a rich field for reflection on how we understand freedom, morality, and authenticity. So, why does this matter? 1. If meaning is created, what prevents chaos? 2. If meaning is given, what role does personal choice play? 3. Is identity something you discover or something you choose? 4. Which approach seems more honest to human experience? 5. Which version of existentialism feels more compelling to you, and why? Remember that in Christian ethics, the very concept of imago Dei calls us to lead an authentic life, despite the challenges faced by the existentialist anxiety, other people, and the endless amount of options available to us. We are asked to live in response to our calling, which comes from God Himself, and within this an adventure awaits, which is nothing short of purposeful, relational, and authentic.